Hello, and welcome to another episode of Tierah Ruins Things with Science, a podcast about the science of infectious diseases in pop culture. I am Tierah, and I am here to ruin your favorite TV shows and movies by telling you how badly they butchered the science. Today, I'm going to be talking about the movie that made me want to be a science nerd, which is the classic 1996 Michael Bay film, The Rock. If you're not familiar with it, The Rock features Nicolas Cage as a chemist that works for the FBI, who is called in to help them disarm some domestic terrorists that have taken over Alcatraz Island armed with rockets that have VX nerve gas in them. So, while of course Michael Bay takes, some liberties and artistic license with what people might pedantically like to call the truth, in terms of the science in this movie, though, surrounding the VX nerve gas, this is a fairly accurate movie, oddly enough. There are a couple caveats, of course, and I also went down a pretty fun rabbit hole and developed a new headcanon about the movie V for Vendetta. I will be giving some spoilers for the movie, though, so if you haven't seen this yet and don't want the ending spoiled, go watch it first. It's on Disney Plus in Canada, and you can rent it on all the platforms like Google Play, YouTube, all of that. Before we start, I just want to say there's a little bit more swearing in this episode than normal in some of the clips that I play, so if that bothers you, you've been warned.
But what I'm dealing with here is one of the most deadly substances the Earth has ever known.
So, VX gas has been mentioned in many other pop culture related media, from TV shows to other movies, and even some books and songs mention it. Some you may have heard of include Mission Impossible, Rogue Nation, the movie It's a Disaster, the TV shows 24 and Designated Survivor, and the new MacGyver show from 2016. There's a big list on the VX Wikipedia page, which I'll link to if you want to see them all. I've watched a few of them, episodes of certain TV shows, some of the other movies, etc. The mentions are really brief, mostly just in passing. They only mention it in name, except on Designated Survivor. Someone does die of the gas in that show. It's not very accurate, though. To be able to tell you how VX works and to critique the movie, I have to tell you a bit about the neuroscience first. I am not a neuroscientist, so don't worry. This will be top-level stuff, and I'll explain it as best I can. So, if you touch something with your finger, for example, the feeling of that touch is transmitted from your fingertip to your brain by neurons. These individual neurons are small. It's not one long strand going directly from your fingertip to your brain. It's more like a Newton's cradle. Those are those stands that, have a bunch of ball bearings hung together, and you lift one on one end and you drop it, and it swings and bangs in, and the one at the other end of the row swings out. So you have a long row of tiny, tiny neurons that lie very close to each other. They're not really exactly touching, though. The end of one neuron is about 20 nanometers or so, give or take, from the start of the next one. For anyone who's forgotten, a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter, so it's very, very small. They're very close. When the neuron in your fingertip is touched, the signal travels down the row of neurons like the force moves through the row of ball bearings, and then the one at the very end swings out and hits your brain. This signal is transferred from neuron to neuron with chemicals called neurotransmitters. The most common one is called acetylcholine, which gets released from the end of one neuron. It travels across the tiny 20 nanometer gap to the start of the next and binds a receptor there. This transmits a signal through the cell to the opposite end, where it happens again. It's all very quick and happens in only a few hundredths of a second. When it's time to stop transmitting the signal, an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase comes along and chops the acetylcholine in half. What nerve agents do is get in the way. They get in the way of either the neurotransmitter binding to the receptor or in the way of the enzyme so it can't chop the neurotransmitter up. This means either you can't transmit a signal at all in the first place, or you can't stop transmitting once you've started. Either of these will result in death, and usually fairly quickly. This is good if, you're an exterminator trying to kill bad bugs, but it's bad if you're a human just trying to go grocery shopping or, swear at the hockey refs for missing a blatant interference call on McDavid. Just, your typical human things. In the realm of nerve agents as chemical weapons, there are two main classes. One is the G series and the other is the V series. The G series is named because German scientists discovered them. GA, also known as tabin, was discovered in 1936, and GB, otherwise known as sarin, you may have heard of that one, was discovered in 1939.
Marvin, sarin is a GB asshole. That is correct.
There are a couple others in this group, GD and GF, and they were all discovered prior to the end of World War II. The V series were discovered/created in the 1950s by British researchers at the UK military's ultra-secretive and controversial Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down. Now, Porton Down is a research park near Porton in Salisbury, and I'm sure this is completely unrelated, but I thought it was interesting that Porton is about a 15-minute drive away from Lark Hill. Lark Hill is the real-world location of the fictional military detention and human experimentation center from Alan Moore's graphic novel and the movie V for Vendetta. There's a great 1-hour BBC documentary in this place called Inside Porton Down. It's available for free online, and I will link to it. The V in the V series agents stands for venomous agent, which implies it's meant to be injected like a venom rather than inhaled like a gas or a poison. But this is where my new headcanon comes in, because I wonder if this had any connection or inspiration for the use of the letter V in V for Vendetta. In V for Vendetta, V is a character who is held in human experimentation camp by a government that researched and tested chemical weapons on its own citizens. And given that Lark Hill is so close to Porton Down, I now like to think that the V in the V series agents inspired the use of the letter V in V for Vendetta. Anyways, the story is these scientists were trying to make new pesticides based on the work done on the G series agents in the 30s and 40s. In the V series, there are quite a few more compounds than in the G series, but they were all ostensibly meant to be pesticides until they were discovered to be too toxic for use this way. The one product that made it to market, Amaton, it didn't wash off the leaves of the plant after it had been applied, and it was found to be very deadly to humans, not just pests, so it was quickly withdrawn. The V-series agents don't have cool names like the G-series ones, like I said, so I'm going to stick to calling VX VX rather than its common name of methylphosphonothioic acid. It's a bit easier to say. The main difference between the G agents and the V agents is that the G agents are volatile and they don't persist very long in the environment after they're released, whereas the V agents are pretty much not volatile at all, so they take an extremely long time to dissipate after they're spread somewhere. So volatility, you can think of it as the tendency to evaporate. Things like water, gasoline, perfumes, scented oils that you put those little sticks in to help it evaporate. These are all very volatile and they evaporate very easily. Ethanol, otherwise known as just alcohol that you drink, is about 2.5 times as volatile as water. And propane is over 400 times as volatile as water. Pure mercury, the metal, is a liquid at room temperature, but it is about 2,300 times less volatile than water. So sarin gas is approximately 1/10 as volatile as water, while VX is over 25,000 times less volatile than water, which means it's basically the same as a rock. And that's impressive for something that is actually a liquid. In pure form, it looks just like water according to the documentary I watched, but it can be mixed with things to make it more stable and thicker, or to make it easier to turn into a gas. Some reports or news stories that I read in my research talk about it being the consistency of honey, and honestly that would make more sense if it's not volatile. So maybe the documentary was trying to avoid showing what the actual compound looks like. I don't know, secret military reasons. Some news stories and people also refer to it as VX gas and talk about fumes. But again, for something that has the volatility of a rock, there has to have been something else done to it to make it volatile. In any case, in order to get sick or die from this, it has to be aerosolized somehow, so you can either breathe it in or get it on your skin. One way is if it were somehow aerosolized and sprayed into the air by maybe putting it in a rocket and then exploding that rocket over the city so it rains down on everyone.
1 teaspoon of this shit detonated in the atmosphere will kill every living organism in an 8-block radius.
So you'd get it on your skin if this happened, which means that even if you had a gas mask, it would still absorb easily through your skin. And since VX and other nerve agents really like to dissolve and stay in fat cells, It would create a little pocket of poison under your skin that would keep killing you even if you washed it off the surface. The VX molecule is a perfect shape to match the active site of acetylcholinesterase, that enzyme that breaks down the neurotransmitter, and it binds to it almost irreversibly. So if you're given a non-fatal dose, it can take 1 to 2 weeks for your acetylcholinesterase levels to return to about 90% of normal. More about that in a bit. Essentially, what this does is prevent you from being able to stop neurotransmission, because more and more acetylcholine just keeps binding to the receptors and isn't broken down. Your impulses just keep firing and firing in what is called rigid paralysis until everything gets overloaded and just shuts off, producing flaccid paralysis, meaning you then go limp and can't move at all. The neurons that acetylcholine controls are mainly in your parasympathetic nervous system. This is the involuntary automatic stuff that your body does to keep you alive and functioning. It includes all the smooth muscles along your intestines and blood vessels, your diaphragm and the small passages in your lungs, the regulation of urine flow from your kidneys to the bladder, even contractions in the uterus and muscles in your skin that raise your hairs and give you goosebumps. Also the dilation of your pupils, among many other things. If you inhale VX, respiratory symptoms will appear first. That's the way it enters your body. So you'd get tightness in the chest, difficulty breathing, you'd be wheezing, your pupils would contract, and you'd get a runny nose. And this is all in a light, non-fatal dose of about 8 parts per billion in the air you're breathing. So a billion particles of air, just for scale, is actually a kind of a small volume, so you breathe that in and out many times per minute. But within that, 8 particles per billion is a very small number, especially considering that oxygen and nitrogen are measured in, parts per hundred or percent, and that's... So a billion particles of air is actually a small volume just for scale, and you breathe that in and out many times per minute. But within that, 8 particles per billion is a very, very small number, considering oxygen and nitrogen and other components of air are usually measured in percent. Now compare that to hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell, which you can smell at about 300 parts per billion, which is very, very little. And it is immediately deadly at concentrations over 500 parts per million. I'm a biologist now, but I originally studied as a chemist through a technical program that was heavily biased towards the oil industry, and we were always told that H2S was one of the most deadly things we could and might encounter. To the point where we were told that if you see someone passed out on the floor of a work area, do not go and see if they're okay. You run the fuck away from there as fast as you can and sound an alarm, because it could be an H2S leak, which will kill you and everyone else pretty fast. So VX is toxic at a level where you may not even be able to smell H2S. When inhaling it, it will incapacitate you at 25 parts per billion, and it is deadly at 30 parts per billion. Compared to H2S, that lethal dose is about 16,000 times lower, and that's for breathing it in. For injecting it under the skin, 10 milligrams will very likely kill you. Visually, if you put 10 milligrams in a little pile, it would be about a quarter the size of, a standard penny. Fentanyl, the opioid painkiller that is causing an overdose crisis in the US and Western Canada, is lethal at about 2 milligrams. So it's in about the same range as that. If you ingest it, perhaps by having a fragile glass ball of it shoved in your mouth and broken, there will first be abdominal cramping, pain, vomiting. You'd probably shit yourself to death as you eventually suffocate. I didn't find a lethal dose for ingestion, but I imagine something similar to injection under the skin, maybe a little lower, as your GI tract surface is very efficient at absorbing things and rapidly distributing them throughout your body. Symptoms of a fatal dose can occur in less than a minute. If you inhaled just barely the fatal dose, your symptoms would progress maybe a little slower than a very high one. You would have twitching and rippling movements of the muscles under the skin, followed by muscle weakness all over, meaning you'd collapse. Your diaphragm would become almost paralyzed, so your breathing would be labored. Your smooth muscles wouldn't be able to keep all your ducts and glands closed or your blood vessels and alveoli contracted, so all of that would dilate, meaning you would just start leaking everywhere and your blood pressure would drop. Your lungs fill with fluid and you cough. Your nose runs, your eyes water. You drool a really thick, viscous drool, and you might foam at the mouth because you're coughing so much as you drown in your own fluids. If you got a very high lethal dose, you'd progress through all of this very quickly. So people watching would see you collapse, twitch or convulse a little, and then die of suffocation due to your diaphragm being paralyzed, probably all within a minute or two. Now, the nervous among you might be asking, how do I prevent this? First off, don't worry, darlings. The chance of you encountering this are smaller than the concentration that's required to harm you. If you're not already convulsing on the ground, once you've been exposed, you would need to immediately inject yourself into a big muscle like your butt or your thigh with 2 milligrams of atropine. More if you're a bigger person or received a bigger dose. Side note here, it does not need to go directly into your heart like is portrayed in the movie. Something like the upper arm would even be fine, just a bigger muscle, but you have to do it immediately. This will take effect within a minute or so and last for up to half an hour, which gives you enough time to find a hospital, provided you're not still continuously being sprayed or dosed with more VX. Atropine works by blocking acetylcholine's ability to bind its receptor, so it prevents the deadly buildup of acetylcholine stimulation caused by inactivation of the enzyme. Now, as far as what happened in the movie, we see people encounter VX twice. At the beginning of the movie, when the initial nerve agent heist is happening, one of the rockets falls and breaks open, and a few of the neon green glass balls containing VX roll across the floor and break against the wall. Everyone runs out pretty quickly, but one poor dude is left inside the vault, so David Morse locks him inside and watches as his skin boils, he foams at the mouth, and then dies. As I've mentioned, VX is not naturally lime green, but you could add thickeners or dyes to it or something if you wanted it to be that noticeable. From what I've read, it doesn't really harm the efficacy of it, as it were. I think with the exception of the skin boiling, the soldier's death is fairly accurate. The other time a character encounters VX in the movie is near the end, when Stanley Goodspeed is just disarming the final rocket and one of the terrorist soldiers attacks him. They struggle, and Goodspeed ends up shoving a VX ball into the guy's mouth, which breaks it, and it kills him. Goodspeed then pulls out his emergency atropine needle and stabs himself in the heart. He falls to his knees and then falls over. He twitches and lies there for a moment before struggling to get up, and then he runs outside with green smoke flares to signal to stop the incoming airstrike. Now, I said at the top that the science in this movie is fairly accurate, and it's true. Based on all the symptoms and reactions that I read up on and I just went through, I feel like the portrayal in this movie was quite good. Even the FBI science lab stuff at the beginning seemed, reasonably accurate, with its biohazard level 4 suits that have their own supplied air and all of that. All I mention is, like I said, you don't have to stab yourself in the heart with the atropine like poor Stanley did. Any big muscle will do.
Look, how big's this shit? You want me to stick this into my heart? Are you fucking nuts?
Now, I just want to talk about how this stuff has actually been tested or used on humans in real-life scenarios. We do actually have real-life experience to understand its effects. As part of the research on VX at Porton Down, one of the insane scientists working on this project, Dr. Sim, actually volunteered to be the first human subject. There's far too much detail to go through it all, but I will link the report that was declassified on this if you want to read it. Essentially, so at first they gave him a low dose of about 4 micrograms, which is about 1,000 times less than the lethal dose. They say this didn't affect his acetylcholinesterase levels, but it did give him cluster headaches behind his eyeballs, which made him cranky and tired. This was considered a negligible effect, so they gave him another dose, twice the amount of the first one. After that, he got more cluster headaches, he started hyperventilating, felt sweaty, and got abdominal cramps. Now that was all that happened the first time. There was an 18-month wait before it was tested again, and the report notes that this was because they had to seek official permission to continue testing. I like to imagine that the higher-ups then had no idea that this human testing was going to occur, and that the 3 authors of the paper were just sitting around talking about how best to test this stuff. They knew how toxic and lethal it was because the first marketed pesticide was recalled from the market in 1955, and this testing took place in 1958. These guys were probably all sitting around trying to figure out how they could study the effects of this on humans under controlled conditions, and Dr. Sim was probably just like, fuck it, we'll do it live, in that time-honored tradition of scientists testing shit on themselves or using their own bodily fluids and secretions as testing material. Most of the time throughout history, this has resulted in dudes dying of self-inflicted syphilis or yellow fever, although, sometimes they did survive. I say dudes because, unfortunately, yes, most of the scientists throughout history have been men. In one case, the guy who tested a bacterial culture on himself to prove that this bacteria caused stomach ulcers actually got a Nobel Prize for it. So it's not all bad, but it's not recommended. Do not eat your science, please. Anyways, Dr. Sim and colleagues were undeterred, and the second time they tested VX on him, it was much worse. In late 1959, they injected him again, and he received 258 micrograms total. That's still about 15 times lower than a lethal dose, so, not too bad. After this, though, he went very pale, said he felt spinny, he started drooling all over the place, he began vomiting and trying to rip out his IVs and was thrashing. So the testing was stopped at that point, and thankfully he did survive. This was thought to be an immediate success, so they went and got 6 more enlisted, quote, volunteers and gave them various doses. I mentioned earlier that it can take up to 2 weeks for your acetylcholinesterase levels to return to somewhat normal levels, and this is how they know that. The researchers monitored blood levels of acetylcholinesterase of the subjects for about 2 weeks after testing, and they found that the most that some of them returned to was 90% of their pre-testing levels, and one of them only made it up to about 70% of pre-test levels. There has been some animal testing too. Inside Porton Down goes through some tests that the UK government did, including contaminating a whole small island off the coast of Scotland that then had to be quarantined for 40 years. But in the early 60s, the US government also started research into VX. The Dugway Proving Ground in Utah is a notorious U.S. military nerve agent testing ground, among other things like biological weapons and nuclear fallout tests. In 1968, there were 3 open-air tests of nerve agents. They dropped some bombs, they burned some, just for funsies, just to see what would happen. And then 3 days later, reports began to come in that sheep that were being grazed about 30 miles away were dying. Over the next few days, over 6,000 sheep were killed. Eventually, international attention was attracted, and in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, this was very bad. I'm not a historian, I don't know a lot about this time period, but Wikipedia says that eventually it was this testing that led to President Nixon banning open-air chemical weapons testing. So at least it stopped at sheep and not people. Some people haven't been so lucky. Inside Porton Down goes over some events where nerve gases, mainly sarin, were tested on people, and it's not very pretty. The first recorded incidences of VX being used to kill people was in 1994 and 1995 in Osaka, Japan, when members of the cult Om Shinrikyo made a few hundred grams of VX and used it to kill one guy in the street and 13 others in a public subway attack. Last podcast on the left did a real deep dive into this thing, and it's a good series, so go listen to those if you want more details on that. More recently, in 2017, Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, was assassinated at the Kuala Lumpur airport in Malaysia. 2 women came up and wiped some material on his face, and since the women didn't die, although at least one of them experienced some side effects, the thought at the time was that it may have been a binary weapon, where 2 different materials were wiped on his face that then combined to make VX. I tried to find out what these 2 things could be, but even if I had found out, I don't think I would say, as it seems like really dangerous info to have out there, which might be why I couldn't find it myself. It did take some time for Kim to die, but he was alert enough to speak to the emergency personnel that were treating him, though he did pass away on the way to the hospital. There has been much speculation on his death since, and VX itself, it continues to occupy our collective fears and concerns over chemical weapons and terrorism. At least in pop culture, that is. Alright folks, that's all I have for this episode of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. I am a researcher and not a doctor, so please don't take any of this as medical advice. It is for entertainment only. You can follow me on any social media that you find, on Twitter if it still exists, at Biology Selfies, Facebook at Tierah Ruins Things with Science, and I have a TikTok at Tierah Ruins Things. I'll put those names in the show notes, as well as a link where you can see all of my sources. Thank you for listening, and thanks to everyone who helped me bring this episode to life. I did all the research, writing, and recording myself. The music was written and provided by James Stratton Crawley, who also helped with some of the editing. There's a link to his channels in the notes as well. If you have any suggestions for TV show episodes or movies featuring diseases or pathogens that you'd like me to cover, send them in to tierahruinsthings@gmail.com. See you all next time, where I will be talking about the 2010 movie Black Death, starring Sean Bean, Eddie Redmayne, and Carice Van Houten.